Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for joining this virtual event. My name is Charlotte Hebebrand. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Affairs at IFPRI, and it's our pleasure to present today IFPRI's 2021 Global Food Policy Report, which is on transforming food systems after COVID-19, with a special focus today on Africa. We'll be hearing first from IFPRI, and then we will enter into a discussion with some government officials from Ethiopia, Senegal, and Egypt. And then we look forward to also hearing from the African Development Bank and the World Food Program from West Africa. We're then very keen to hear from all of you, and you will have a chance to submit your brief questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. And we'll be coming to the Q&A just after the panel remarks. There will be a translation, interpretation into French, and you can watch that on our French channel on YouTube. Please see the link also in the chat box on the right of your screen. So it's now my great pleasure to invite Jemima Njuki, who's IFPRI's Director of our Africa Division, to give some welcome remarks to this event. Over to you, Jemima.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, and thank you for joining us for this important Africa discussion on the 2021 Global Food Policy Report, whose theme this year is transforming food systems after COVID-19. So you'll all agree the year 2020 was unprecedented in many ways. The pandemic and associated policy responses brought widespread health calamities, economic hardship, severe disruptions to services, and critical restrictions on movement. And although in the Africa region, the health impacts have not been as dire as in other countries and other regions, many vulnerable people faced threats to their immediate food security, their health, and their nutrition. The pandemic also highlighted often exacerbated weaknesses and inequalities in our food systems, and has been a stark reminder of the great vulnerability of the poor and other disadvantaged groups. And I think we know a year on, we are further off track to meeting the SDGs by 2030. But what is clear to all of us, including at IFPRI, is that food systems must play a central role in putting us back on track. So the report we are discussing today offers us many lessons in the region, for the region, on how food systems can be transformed, how they can be strengthened, both to respond to the current challenges of food and nutrition security, but also to prepare us for the next shocks. So I joined IFPRI as Director for Africa when the development of this report was well underway. And having read it, I wanted to just say three things that I really, really like about this report. I had always read the Global Food Policy reports from IFPRI, even when I was on the donor side. First is the report rightly focuses on the impact of the pandemic on health, on nutrition, on jobs, and other aspects. But what's really great about this report is that it also describes some of the food systems innovations that have arisen out of the pandemic, and that governments and other stakeholders in the region have implemented to respond to the pandemic. What has worked, what has not worked, and what we can take forward. The second is that the report provides great regional and country nuances to the data and to the impact and responses. And this is very critical for us and for governments and stakeholders in the region, because it allows for much more precise decision-making and recovery efforts. For example, I was looking at the report talk about the impact of the pandemic on household incomes in Rwanda, Ethiopia on the restrictions on mobility and what that did to labor supply, and what needs to happen to make sure that the recovery is first and reaches the people who need to be reached, the impact on local food systems, including on different types of foods. And third, the report provides information and data on how different groups of people have been affected by the pandemic, but also what kinds of solutions can work for these different groups, whether it's the rural poor, the urban poor, whether it's women, and so on. It's a report that really is precise in ways that, as governments, as different stakeholders, can actually take some of the lessons to build back better. So thank you all so much, and we are looking forward to all your contributions, your reactions, and even more importantly, how you can use some of the data and evidence in this report to support and to develop recovery plans beyond this. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Jemima, also for highlighting the fact that this report, on the one hand, it does describe the very disruptive impact COVID-19 has had on food systems around the world. And yet it also offers some hope and some examples of very good responses to the crisis. So with that, we'll now move to get an overview of the key findings from this report. And we have two stellar presenters here to present the report. We will kick off with Joost Winnen, who is the Director General of IFPRI, and then we will turn to John McDermott, who's the Director of the CGIAR Research Program on Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. Both of them played a key role in pulling together this report. You can imagine what a difficult task this was as COVID continued throughout 2020 and of course into 2021. And yet we really tried very hard to already get some important research findings out as soon as possible. So with that, let me turn to Joost Winnen.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody who is joining us. Bonjour, bonsoir. Thank you very much, Jemima, for this very kind introduction to our report. Jemima, it was interesting to hear you say I've read the Global Food Policy Report when I was outside IFPRI, and now when I'm inside IFPRI. We are very excited that you're actually reading it now as you are inside IFPRI, because we are delighted to have Jemima joining us. We expect her to play a very important role in developing our work in Africa in the coming years. I'm going to share the overall perspective with John. The whole report was very much a team effort, not just between John McDermott and myself, but with everybody who's been involved in writing chapter and contributing analysis. And Sambinin will also present some of the insights for Africa. And next slide, please. So I will do more a bit of the analytical, the background setting, and John will be very specific on the key conclusions, key policy findings that we have. Just this slide, I just inserted this slide to give you also to warn you or inform you that IFPRI has been developing for many years now what we call tools and resources. These are monitoring devices, these are data sets, these are indicators that everybody can use. They are publicly available, and so this is just one page from the report. There are several of these, and so I do encourage you to go them, and all of these data and monitoring devices are accessible through online devices. Next slide, please. We know that on the right-hand side, this is what I have started to call the food system flower, if you want. If all these objectives are fulfilled, health, resilience, inclusiveness, sustainable efficiencies, that's what we are striving for when the food system blossoms, if you want. John will go in more detail on each of these and to link our findings to these specific objectives. We know that, I mean, we talk a lot about COVID in the report, but we put this report much in a broader perspective, in a longer term perspective. And so on the left-hand side, you see these are the famous data from, or infamous data from FAO, if you want, which show that despite or after many decades of significant improvement in hunger reduction, we have seen a worsening of the situation since 2015. Next slide, please. There are several reasons for that. Climate change is obviously one. There are others as well. But if we look at the reduction of economic growth really is an important one. And also conflicts, which have increased very strongly over the past year, have also played a very important role. If we look beyond hunger, then we see that the nutrition data are much worse actually than the hunger data. So 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. About 2 billion people, estimates put that, 2 billion people have micronutrient deficiencies. Child malnutrition is really way beyond what we should deem acceptable on this planet. Next slide, please. At the same time, so we have the problematic hunger data, the malnutrition data. Our food system is pushing the planetary boundaries, and climate change is reinforcing this. So we know there's a very important bidirectional interaction between food systems and climate change. Climate change are really affecting our capacity to produce nutritious food, but at the same time, our food system is contributing to climate change because it's consuming a very large share of energy resources and producing more than 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Next slide, please. COVID-19, we all know now, has had very significant impacts on health and poverty. The estimates from IFPRI, IFPRI has used a set of methodologies. We have global models, local models, we have survey work, and analytical work, different types of analytical work based on different data, and I'll present the report, draws on all of these. These are results from our simulation results from our global model, predicting around 150 million more hungry people in the world linked to poverty, actually more poor people in the world, and of course that's linked to food insecurity, and these numbers have been fairly consistent with what we observe today. The impact on nutrition, that's on the right-hand panel, is also estimated, and there we find a significant shift away from the more healthy foods, such as fresh fruits and vegetables, animal products, towards basic staples, basically calories. Next slide, please. We know that poor people are disproportionately affected. And why is that? For a number of reasons. We have a section in the report talking explicitly about inclusion. And so some of the reasons are the main assets of poor people is physical labor. A large share of their income goes to food. They see more disruption both in the public supply chain, such as the social and the nutrition programs, and in the private supply chains of food, which are typically more intensive, more labor intensive, sorry, in developing countries. And we all know that they have less access to health services. Next slide, please. These are some results from Africa. These are based on our survey work in different countries. And so this is an example from Ethiopia. And there we find that our survey work indeed confirms. And so this is from urban Ethiopia, that the poorest have seen stronger income declines from their already lower incomes, and on the nutrition side as well. So they are obviously consuming less of the more healthy products for them. And there the decline is actually more significant for the poorest and the middle income countries compared to the richest households, which have been keeping up that consumption relatively well. Next slide, please. The impact, what is interesting is our findings on the rural versus urban effects. If we look at the poverty effects, and these are results from country level modeling that we have done in almost 18 countries now. And so this is data from Indonesia, Ghana, Nigeria. And there we've seen that the impact of the lockdown effects are very strong in terms of economic declines, but that there is not that much difference between the rural and the urban. And if anything, the urban effects are larger than the urban income declines are larger than the rural effect. And this has to do to some extent with the food chain. And so if we go to the next slide, please. There we see that if you look along the foods value chain, then we see that food services, food trade, etc., have been affected very, very strongly. And that agriculture, which obviously has suffered significantly, minus 14% is important, but considerably less than activities further down the value chains, which are more concentrated in urban centra. And of course, urban poor have also been strongly affected by declines in services overall, industry, employment, etc. But at the same time, most of the poor in the world live in rural areas. And so it's kind of this mixed effect, which makes that we have a bit of a complex effect, but that vulnerability has increased both in urban and in rural areas very strongly. Next slide, please. Women and children are especially vulnerable. That comes out of many of our country work. And so we find that there's a number of reasons for that. We find that health measures are affecting women and men differently. Income shocks have strong gendered impacts. And the impact on women's empowerment and children's schooling is likely to affect both the current labor force participation, but also in the future generation. And we know these things are tremendously important from a long-term perspective. And this also holds for children. We see that there's been a significant increase in terms of wasting, child mortality, etc. And so, of course, mortality is the worst, but also the malnutrition effect with children has long-lasting effects. We all know that by now. Next slide, please. If you look at the supply chains, this is the issues I talked about were mostly demand-driven, where the effects are very, very strong. And so here we have data from Myanmar, where we looked at, okay, so where along the supply chains is, or what is affecting your food security the most? And there we see, again, the demand side effects coming through very strongly. Household income and job losses are a much more important effect for people's food insecurity than food supply chain disruptions. And this has a number of reasons. There's also some dynamics and heterogeneity on the food supply chains. What we see that initially there has been quite significant disruption in many supply chains around the world, but there's been a lot of innovations. Next slide, please. On the food supply chain, both in terms of how these supply chains are organized, technological innovations, etc. And we see a lot of heterogeneity between global versus local, the intensity of factors that are used, capital, labor, knowledge, and multinational supply chains versus local, smaller ones. But overall, I think the conclusion there is much more nuanced. We've seen resilience at different levels. We've seen vulnerability at different levels. And I think it's really important to look at that. Next slide, please. I think the innovations that we've seen there is a general lesson, I think, across societies. We have seen that there has been a lot of creativity and innovation, not just in the private sector value chains, also at the level of public policy. There's been a significant extension of social safety nets. Also, for example, how to deal with school feeding programs when the schools are closed, etc. Organization of consumers, the introduction of new digital technologies, etc. And I think that's really an important lesson taking forward. I think also the innovation in our mind is really important, that we are thinking or have to be forced to think outside the box, outside the traditional constraints. And 2021 is a really important moment with all the global summits out there, the United Nations Food System Summit, the one, but there's several other ones. And so I think here it's really important to focus both public sector, private sector, with the role that the NGOs, etc., can play to use the lessons from the crisis to transform the food system as a whole. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Yo. John, will you continue the presentation?
Yes, I'll just go ahead, thanks. Can you put up my slides, please? I'm going to focus on, as Yo said, giving you an overview of what's in the report, what you can expect. There are different types of products that you can look at in summary form, etc. So that's useful. Next slide, please. Now, in aggregate, we had huge disruptions, both health and economic. And this summarizes the cumulative deaths and the GDP growth, or decline in this case, that we saw during the year. And these were pretty dramatic. There's a lot of optimism early in 2021 about GDP growth, but that's going to depend on the pandemic, and that's far from clear in many regions of the world, including Africa. And there's going to be this dynamic between health and economics. Next slide. Now, countries have really been on their own in responding to this. There's been some international support. I don't want to say there hasn't. International financial institutes have provided critical finance to help countries make some initial responses. But each country is making their own decisions, and that's really important. We have one of the things we've tried to do is look at the policy responses that countries did make And we find that when there's adaptability, when there's kind of coordination, and when there's kind of attention to how the policies get implemented, they're a lot more successful. And that comes out as a recurring theme in terms of the policy responses that people tried. Next slide, please. There was a lot of regional differences. In the regions, we focused on three major questions. The first was, what was their kind of food systems aspirations and plans prior to COVID? How did those get changed during COVID? And did that change the overall plans for food system transformation going forward? And for the Africa region, Sam is going to go through this and lay out what we've seen so far. Next slide. Now, in terms of food system transformation, traditionally we have focused on three objectives, and this is very consistent with the Committee of World Food Security's framework for food systems. So health, sustainability, and inclusion have been the high-level objectives, and they remain. But obviously there's a lot more emphasis on resilience that's come up because of COVID, and we'll talk more about that. But also the opportunities for efficiency and the importance of the private sector role in this is very important. So for each of these 5 objectives, we have a thematic chapter, and I'll go through those now. Next slide. So on nutrition, as Yo pointed out, before the pandemic, we had 3 billion people that couldn't afford the diets we thought they should eat, the healthy diets they thought they should eat. That's another 10% now. And he showed the slides of how we're seeing less fruit and vegetable, less animal source foods for children who need them. This is a big concern of countries and has been overall in terms of the dietary transition, increasing obesity, etc. And a lot of African countries are working on food-based dietary guidelines and dietary standards, and this is going to move forward. So this is a critical part of thinking about healthy diets. Next slide. One thing that's kind of lagged behind, understandably, in a crisis is the sustainability part in terms of natural resources and environment. And despite the fact that there's strong links between this and pandemics and epidemics and the risks of them. So I won't go into this too much, but there's 2 kind of responses that we advocate in this chapter. One is around really integrating natural resource and environment and climate change into food system thinking, which is lagging behind in many countries. And also to think about multi-pronged approaches, bundles of things, institutions, governance, policy, technology put together as multi-pronged solutions to some of our sustainability issues. Next slide. Inclusion is obviously a huge topic, and Yo presented many of those things. One thing I would like to emphasize here is that we feel that there needs to be a rethink in terms of how we think about inclusion and much more systematic responses, bringing together the basic needs that people have, food, water, health, income, because the poor people are really suffering. And then how do we make that more systematic? We've been doing things piecemeal, and that needs to change. Next slide. One kind of interesting thing is there's been huge differences in responses to how food supply chains work. Some have been disrupted, some haven't, but overall availability of food has been pretty good. The problem is more accessibility, the price side. And we've seen some incredible innovations that might have taken 5 years without COVID that are happening in a few months now. I think our basic message here is that this interplay between public enabling and private capacity to respond has been critical. And that's, I think, an important part for food system transformation going forward. Next slide. On resilience, that's obviously come up as a key issue. We don't think that resilience trumps the other objectives of the food system. It needs to be considered with them. And we looked at resilience from kind of 3 capacities. One is how to mitigate the frequency and severity of shocks, so a more proactive role. really the real-time information systems to anticipate, to respond, and then building back capacity in our systems to absorb shocks. So those are the three kind of resilience elements that we focused on. Next slide, please. And then kind of what's next? Well, that remains to be seen. As I said in the beginning, not quite clear where things are going to go. This is a long-term pandemic, as we've seen a long time ago in the Spanish flu. And so there's a lot of adjustments to be made, and the variants cause another thing, because we're talking about infections of billions of people, not tens of thousands that we see in Ebola. So there's a lot of changes that are happening. We're quite concerned that it's really exposed inequalities and how we need more concerted support for vulnerable groups. We have to get back on board for climate, conflict, financial crises, and other shocks, as well as health shocks, which will probably increase in frequency. This relationship between public and private and how they work together in transforming food systems is critical. And then on the policy side, it's really important to have resilient policy systems that are sustainable, that are coherent, that can move forward. And what we've seen is the countries that have systems that can be adapted and adjusted quickly have been the ones that have been able to respond. And we need better cross-sectoral coordination. This is between health, between food, between economics. So let me stop there and hand back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, John. And thanks also to Yo. We'll now take a deeper dive into the Africa results. And Sam Benin is with us. He is the Deputy Division Director for IFPRI's African office and is the author of the Africa chapter in the GFPR this year. Over to you, Sam.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. So I want to recognize my co-authors for this chapter, which is including John Ulumwengu and Kwao Andam. So at the time of writing this chapter or section in the regional chapter, starting last year and a little bit in the beginning of the year, so much has happened more. Next slide, please. But the general result in terms of comparing Africa to the rest of the world is still consistent in the sense that the health impacts in Africa have so far been lower compared to other regions. So if we look at, for example, Africa accounts for about 17% of the world's population, but in terms of the COVID pandemic health impacts, we can see the cases are much lower as well as the deaths. It's not to underplay those figures because we know the families have been really affected, but to show that Africa has not been that much impacted. But even, and the main reasons for that is because of Africa's larger youth population, a bit on the climate, warmer climate, and also space that is not much as dense as in other places, and so linked to behavioral practices. But we also know that there are a lot of regional and country differences in the continent. So as you can see on the slides, we see that Southern Africa and Northern Africa have been the most impacted compared to the other three regions: Western, Eastern, and Central Africa, with Central Africa being the lowest in several of the indicators. It is, we also know that in terms of reporting on incidents, etc., they may be lower than the cases are. So the most significant indicator is the number of deaths, because we don't have many unexplained deaths, and so those are very close to what is happening. And if you look at the death per million people, you can see that Southern Africa is really impacted there. And it accounts for about half the cases in terms of Africa's death, nearly 45%. Next slide, please. So the factors that has made Africa being the least impacted in terms of compared to other global regions also helps to explain the differences across the sub-regions in the continent as well as across countries. So if you look at the annual average temperatures, you can see that Southern Africa and Northern Africa tend to be a bit cooler in certain months, and so they are conducive to the spread of the disease during those months. If you look at population density, you can already see, even though the Western Africa places are also very densely populated, because of temperatures also probably helping there. And then the chart on the right-hand side gives you the age distribution, looking at the population above 65 years old. And there you can see, even though Africa on average has about 3% of that population, you can see that Northern Africa and also South Africa have much more, way above 5%. And so all of these factors is helping to explain the differences there. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on is the gateway to the rest of the world in terms of connectivity. So for example, South Africa and Egypt, these two countries alone have 6 of the top 10 busiest airports in the continent. And so it just tells you the connectivity to Europe and also the connectivity to Asia is just huge in these two countries. And so it is not surprising that, adding all of these factors make them very vulnerable. Next slide, please. So until that there's vaccination, what it means is that the sort of practices that we all know about, masking, distancing, etc., are very, very important. And here you can see how Africa lags behind the rest of the world. But basically, if we look at the top 3 countries where the incidence and death are occurring, United States, followed by India and Brazil, you can see that the rate of vaccination is much higher in the US compared to Brazil and India. And Africa is just a little under 1%. So it tells you that the global pandemic is way from being over, at least in terms of looking at a population that is vaccinated. Africa accounts for about 2% of the world vaccines that have been vaccinated. And the chart on the right-hand side, you can see the huge disparity in terms of every other country having less than 1%, with Morocco at about 12% and the Seychelles at about 60%. Next slide, please. So if we tend to look at the socioeconomic impacts, largely deriving from the lockdown effects, basically restricting supply chains, production processes, already as discussed by John and Yo. Then we can see how they impacted different parts of the continent. So we know that the policies varied across the continent, basically in terms of the countries where they were applied, the start and the end of the lockdown periods, the sector, travel, etc. Many of these have eased after the initial lockdown periods, also from a lot of the protests that took place. But we know that since the cases still continue, some of these restrictions have been eased, some remain, and some new ones have been also put in place in 2021, especially around travel. And we know that there are some city curfews, start of businesses, the operating hours of businesses, etc. And countries like Tanzania, which were very slow in picking up on this, have come onto it. So, for example, the chart on the bottom on your bottom right-hand side gives you the impact on how GDP has been affected, as well as how poverty has gone up. Next slide, please. So, in addition to the lockdown policies, many governments also put in place fiscal, monetary, and balance of payments policies, for example, to help buffer the socioeconomic impacts. And here we see lots of variation across countries. But mostly we see that there was support to specific sectors, health definitely, and some of the other sectors include the tourism and hotel industry, as well as to agriculture. And also government made several transfers to businesses and households, both direct and indirect transfers. For household, especially those that are particularly vulnerable and were laid off to the pandemic. Most notably, we see that social protection coverage increased, nearly quadrupled, going from 3% prior to the pandemic to about 11% in June. But these policies come at a cost in terms of the higher government expenditure, as well as the foregone revenue on several of the policies that were put in place. On average, for Africa as a whole, this was estimated around $38.5 billion US, which is about for all of African countries. If we look to the right, to your right-hand side, the chart gives you some of the variation across the different countries. And the most thing to note here is that several of the countries actually did not have enough to cover them, to cover that cost. So we already can anticipate future fiscal risk for those countries. Next slide, please. So in terms of going forward, what are the main things to do here? And that comes back again to Africa's vulnerability. Already we know of the climate change. We can also think of the not too distant Ebola, the outbreak, fall armyworm, locust infestation, etc. So all of these put Africa in that state. Also with increasing connectivity to the rest of the world, like I said, I mentioned earlier. So basically, the fundamental thing is taking a food system approach to policy planning and implementation based on Africa's own situation and dynamics with respect to climate, biodiversity, demography, urbanization, value chains, etc. And we already see how those are impacting the sub-regional differences and cross-country differences. So these factors really need to be brought into the planning processes. Increasing efficiency of public spending, because the shocks and responses are becoming more frequent, and those demand the already part of the scarce public resources. So efficiency in the current spending is very, very important. Also broadening the revenue base. Africa in general spends about a quarter of GDP, which is much lower compared to other developing countries. But not only is the percentage that they're spending lower, the base is already small. So it does not give enough to be able to expand investment into some of these key areas that we think are important. Infrastructure, early warning, monitoring, evaluation systems, continuing the COVID testing is very key, R&D, education, and health. So bringing in the informal sector into more of the formal sector, providing them with resources and tools to expand their own productivity and production would help to provide the task base so that government can broaden the revenue and be able to implement this. Before I go off, I wanted to mention that, so since the first COVID case in Egypt, the African Union got together to put in place a continental strategy. Following what is happening in India, over the weekend, they again met with the ministers of health for the whole day, I think on Saturday or Sunday. And that shows you how Africa is looking to combat this. And there's already 3 things that they are talking about. One is the African Medicines Agency, the Partnership for African Vaccines Manufacturing, as well as the Treaty on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. So let me end it here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam, also for that update at the end of your remarks, which is really important given the shocking disparity in the rate of vaccinations if you look at Africa compared to, say, the US. So we're now going to have some responses to the report from different governments in the region. And we will kick off actually with a presentation from Senegal. We're very honored to have with us Younoussa Mambalo, who's the technical advisor and coordinator of the Provali CV project. He works with the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Equipment in Senegal. And he will be speaking in French. So for those of you that would like to, well, you'll be on the French channel, on the YouTube channel. He will be presenting in French. Monsieur Mambalo, c'est notre plaisir de vous entendre maintenant. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Je vous remercie tous et bonjour à tout le monde. C'est au nom du ministre de l'Agriculture et de l'Équipement rural du Sénégal que je prends la parole aujourd'hui pour vous remercier pour cette invitation que vous avez bien voulu nous adresser pour partager et donner nos appréciations sur ce document extrêmement important et pertinent, document dans lequel vous avez présenté des constats, vous avez fait des constats, vous avez fait une bonne analyse aussi de la situation que nos différents pays ont vécue dans le cadre, en tout cas, de cette pandémie de Covid-19. Au Sénégal, nous avons eu notre premier cas. Le premier cas de Covid-19 a été enregistré le 2 mars 2020. Et bien sûr, comme tous les pays, après ce premier cas, quelque temps après, des mesures ont été prises pour pouvoir en tout cas faire face à cette pandémie. Et parmi ces mesures, il y a celles qui en fait qui ont consisté à surtout limiter les déplacements des populations. Et ça, naturellement, ça a créé, en tout cas, ça a eu un impact sur l'agriculture. Au Sénégal, heureusement, quand ce phénomène donc a eu lieu, quand cette mesure a été prise, il y avait déjà la fin de la campagne de commercialisation de l'arachide, qui est la production majeure au Sénégal, comme vous le savez, l'arachide. Alors, la commercialisation avait presque pris fin. Par contre, pour l'horticulture, on était en pleine campagne, surtout de commercialisation. Et c'est justement au niveau de l'horticulture que nous avons eu les plus grosses difficultés en 2020. Et ces mesures donc de restriction qui ont été prises, je le disais, ont impacté négativement sur les revenus des producteurs, du fait donc des difficultés liées à la mise en marché des produits en général, et ainsi des quantités importantes de produits sont restées invendues. Alors, il y a non seulement cet impact donc pour le secteur de l'horticulture, mais il y avait eu aussi un impact sur le secteur de l'élevage. C'est la même chose, c'est le même constat, du fait surtout de la fermeture des marchés hebdomadaires. Vous savez, dans nos pays, en tout cas au Sénégal, en milieu rural, il y a des jours chaque semaine qui sont choisis par localité où tous les producteurs amènent leurs produits et tous les acheteurs sont là également pour acheter les produits agricoles. Ces marchés ont été fermés, donc il n'y avait plus possibilité aussi de vendre aussi bien des produits horticoles que des produits d'élevage. Alors, vous imaginez un peu que ces impacts ont beaucoup plus impacté sur les couches vulnérables que constituent donc les petits producteurs. Pour faire face à ces difficultés, le gouvernement du Sénégal avait adopté ce qu'on appelle un plan national de résilience économique et sociale, qui a mis l'accent sur la nécessité de produire plus et mieux. Mais dans ce sillage, justement, comme on était à la veille de la campagne hivernale, le gouvernement a augmenté substantiellement le budget du programme de campagne, qui est passé de 40 milliards à 60 milliards. Et ça, c'était surtout pour renforcer les capacités des producteurs afin de leur permettre d'avoir des intrants, les semences et les engrais notamment. Donc ça, c'est un appui conséquent qui a été pris. Alors, par ailleurs aussi, vous savez, au Sénégal, il y a ce qu'on appelle le plan Sénégal émergent. C'est un plan qui est conçu, une vision du chef de l'État jusqu'à l'horizon 2035. Dans ce plan, il y a ce qu'on appelle des plans d'action prioritaires, les PAP, avec des séquences de 3 ans, 5 ans, etc. Ça dépend. Il y avait un PAP 2 qui était en cours de mise en œuvre à l'époque. Avec la pandémie, le gouvernement a été amené à réajuster et revoir ce PAP pour le caler jusqu'en 2023, mais des ajustements ont été opérés. Et dans le domaine agricole, il y a 3 programmes majeurs qui ont été adoptés. Il y a un programme national d'autosuffisance en riz. Le Sénégal est un pays grand consommateur donc de riz. Il y a un programme national de développement des cultures céréalières, autres donc que le riz, le mil, le sorgho, etc. Mais il y a eu aussi un programme de développement de l'horticulture. Donc, par rapport à tout ça, il y a eu donc des actions qui ont été faites. Alors, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que dans leur approche, tous ces 3 programmes ont pris en compte les types de mesures que vous avez préconisées tout à l'heure dans votre document. Il s'agit surtout des mesures visant à renforcer l'investissement et dès maintenant dans l'atténuation des changements climatiques, l'accès à l'information et l'accès au financement et au programme donc, de recherche-développement. Donc, nous approuvons la pertinence de ces mesures et vous exprimons en tout cas notre disponibilité à poursuivre la réflexion avec vous. Je ne voudrais pas terminer sans saluer la représentation donc de IFPRI ici au Sénégal et féliciter son équipe pour le travail appréciable qu'elle a à nos côtés. Je ne veux pas être plus long parce que je n'ai que 5 minutes, mais sur ces mots, je voudrais vous remercier et de votre aimable attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Mbalo. Thank you very much for giving us this overview of the impact that COVID had on different agricultural sectors in Senegal, as well as for outlining the policy responses which the government took. And we thank you also for your offer to keep working with us as we follow further the developments in Senegal. We now will move to Egypt, and I am going to turn this over to Mr. Mohamed El-Kirsch, who works with the Ministry of Agriculture in Egypt. Thank you so much, Mr. El-Kirsch.
Thank you so much for this invitation. Actually, it's a great honor to be joining with this staff in this important session. Actually, the COVID-19 has a great impact on not only on the agriculture sector, but on all over the lifestyle of the whole world. Actually, if we are going to speak about the impact of COVID-19 on the agricultural sector, we should refer to the decline on the international trade that in many documents it was said that it may be about 30% of the total international trade. So it's very important to know that the decline on the international trade will have a bad effect on the agriculture sector because of many countries depend on the exportation of the agriculture products to outside. Not only that's the reason, but also the agriculture products is raw material for industrial issues like juice and paste and many other products that have been using the agriculture products to be used. So COVID-19 and the lockdown of the countries within many countries and the decreasing the movement of the international trade will have a great effect on smallholders, especially not only the smallholder, but the sector, but all the sector actually, but the smallholder will be the key point within the pandemic, within this pandemic, because of the decline and the decline in the movement and reduced movement will make the agriculture products be a waste, and go to be destroyed. By the way, many products like milk, which will be destroyed very fast. Also, tomato, many other crops will be destroyed very fast. So we should take and consider how to make the products marketable wise, able to be marketed and able to make connections between the smallholders and the consumer. In Egypt, we try to have many solutions for this issue. We make digital transformation for many sectors of the agriculture sector, of the agriculture Ministry of Agriculture, to avoid the lockdown and to avoid the restrictions on the movement on the people. We make Shari application. Shari application is an application funded by IFPRI, and we try to make connection between the farmer and especially smallholder farmer and the consumer itself. We expect that it might have a great effect on the income of the farmer. Also, we make AgriMasr, which is an application. By this application, all the inputs for the agriculture sector could be bought by the smallholder directly from the web. And we depend on the smart card, which is called Kart al-Fallah. This card contains an e-payment, and any farmer in Egypt, we try to make him have this e-card. And also we try to make the farmer depend on the artificial intelligence, by the way. Actually, we made many applications to support the farmer. Even during the restriction of the movement, we try to avoid any large groups to be in the same place to avoid this COVID-19. All what we are going to speak about affects on the policies and affects on the food security of the country. So actually, I suppose that using the digital transformation in the agriculture sector will be a very comprehensive and a very important key to be used to avoid the impact of the COVID-19. Actually, in Egypt, we have a good efforts within this side. I try to to conclude what's happened in Egypt in a few minutes, but actually I should have a lot of time to speak about the efforts of Egypt, but I will respect the Michelle message to finish the presentation now. So thank you, and hoping that I covered everything in this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. El-Kirsch. We hope to have a more detailed discussion on Egypt soon with a special launch of this report there as well. Thank you also for highlighting the speeding up of digital innovations during COVID-19. I think that is an important theme that emerges from many countries, as IFPRI researchers found. We're now going to move into a second panel, and we'll hear from two very important organizations working on the continent and important partners of IFPRI as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce Martin Ferghini, who is the Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for us to join this very important discussion on the impact of COVID-19 and this the disruptions that it has caused to both food security, nutrition, and resilience. And like has been shown in the excellent slide presented by Johan and also by John, we have seen that COVID-19 has convulsed the global economy. in 2020 into 2021, the number of people experiencing hunger in Africa have increased from 214 million to 246 million. And just over the last couple of years, last 3 years or so, the number of malnourished and wasted children has also continued to rise. The World Food Program released a report that of the UN, the World Food Program of the UN released a report in April that shows 20 countries facing acute hunger and famine. Of these 20 countries, 16 are the African continent. The number of Africans facing acute hunger has increased from 4.3 million in January 2020 to well over 25 million as of today. The last week of April 29, 17 African heads of states gathered at a meeting co-hosted by the AFDB and IFAD. IFPRI was also a part of that meeting. The 17 heads of states expressed concern about the rising number of hungry Africans, and also expressed concerns about how COVID-19 has led to an increasing number of malnourished Africans, and also has led to increasing fragility in the food systems. They also noted how climate-driven natural disasters, massive low-cost invasions is wreaking havoc on African agriculture. It is no longer a question of does Africa need to do something about its agriculture? No, it's now a question of how will Africa rebuild to have a more resilient and a more robust agricultural system? How will Africa, deal with this pandemics, and deal with the droughts, and also deal with the climate change, events and the low cost, without having to suffer, a huge increase in hungry people, or without having to have children, compromised, the future of children compromised because of poor nutrition. At that meeting, it was decided that action had to be taken, and taken very urgently. And the African Development Bank, IFAD, and other multilateral development banks are going to be supporting 5 of the decisions taken at that meeting by the heads of states was, first and foremost, based upon successful homegrown interventions, Africa needs to accelerate the scaling up of success of climate adapted food production technologies. For example, heat tolerant wheat varieties, drought tolerant maize varieties, agricultural inputs, have to be given to the farmers in a very efficient way. The second thing was, we need to create an enabling policy to attract private sector investments into ensuring efficient uptake and affordability of new technologies. The third thing was, we need to also look at, access to markets. So we have to look at infrastructure backbones to ensure that the excess production actually makes its way to processing, value addition, makes its way to a market. They also commended the bank's special agro-industrial processing zones effort. The fourth thing they said was the call for a financing facility for food and nutrition security. This financing facility is going to provide access, affordable access to countries to scale up climate resilient and successful agricultural technologies, including digital innovations that we have seen can help get around some of the disruptions caused by COVID-19. This facility is also going to help to combat malnutrition and stunting in children by diversifying food baskets, particularly nutritious food like vegetables, poultry products, eggs, chicken, meats, and things like that, and also very important, fish. This facility is being set up right now as we speak between the bank and IFAD, and we are looking to formally launch the facility at the UN Food Systems Summit later in the year. During the meeting, the multilateral development banks committed $7.21 billion to helping to accelerate food and nutrition security in Africa. The African Development Bank committed $10.4 billion over the next 5 years. And the idea is to ensure that African countries, it's pretty simple, that the African countries can set targets for the key priorities in their countries. African countries can also assemble the partners, both international and national agricultural and research partners, the private sector, civil society, and come up with a roadmap, a clear roadmap on how to scale food production technologies, and then also implement that map and ensure that accountability for the funds received, is a watchword. We have seen how countries like Sudan and Ethiopia have scaled up heat-tolerant wheat varieties, in the last few years. Over a total of more than 200,000 hectares, these varieties are now being grown, and they have helped Sudan to increase production of wheat from under 400,000 metric tons to over 1 million metric tons. It can be done. It has been done before, and this fund is to help African countries do it. We also note that the UN Food System Summit is going to be a place to actually present some of these results and to seek support from the world and the global community, to ensure that Africa is not left behind. Talking about COVID-19, without food, vaccines don't work. Can we know that? So, as much as we are, addressing the health emergency, we also need to address, the agriculture emergency. Agriculture has been shown, every dollar investment in agriculture has been shown to be able to combat poverty, to be able to increase GDP growth in many African countries. And also, we cannot continue with this kind of food systems. They're really fragile and affected, so much by the impact of COVID-19. Let me stop here, and then thank you very much again for the invitation to speak at this very important meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for a very good overview of what's happening at the African Development Bank. It's now my pleasure to turn to Chris Nikoi, who's the Regional Director for West Africa of the World Food Program. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. First, and let me start by commending IFPRI for the very high quality and also the timeliness of this report. There's no question that COVID-19 has offered all of us an opportunity to learn and to collectively rethink how to improve food systems and how to turn this crisis into an opportunity. I think, first of all, it will be worth mentioning that food insecurity has been exacerbated by the pandemic, especially in the West and Central African regions, which is where my area of responsibility. And in fact, the latest cadre harmonisé results project that 31 million people will be food insecure in the upcoming laying season, which is 150% higher than it was if you compare to just 2019, 150% higher. Allow me to maybe make a few takeaways from the report related to food security and nutrition. That certainly resonates very well with some of the lessons we have learned in the region. First one is that this new challenge, which we are observing, it's worth mentioning is an overall increase, the whole overall increase in vulnerability. Vulnerable groups have been the most affected. Loss of incomes combined with also high increases in prices. And also new vulnerabilities have appeared, especially in urban settings or in countries where food security status used to be rather, not too bad. And I'm thinking of countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, for example, who have been heavily impacted by this situation. There are a couple of recommendations that I'd like to outline, okay? One is the need to strengthen food systems resilience and preparedness to shocks by investing in early warning and also improve capacities of all the actors to absorb the shocks. And this is quite well captured in chapter 2 of the report. The need to promote solutions to maintain or even restore ecosystems and natural resources. You touch on that also in chapter 4 quite well. Then the need to further support local small, medium enterprises, both in terms of investments and also creating an enabling business environment. and for supply chains to be more inclusive, especially of smallholder farmers. And this is also touched on in the report. The need to develop social protection and safety nets that can be quickly scaled up, sort of shock responsive social protection systems in supporting the most vulnerable groups, increased affordability of nutritious diets, and then also the whole question of gender. And these are all well captured in the report. And then also the need to invest in evidence generation to further support policy direction and the effort of policymakers. And this also well captured. While action is needed now, we should also be mindful of some of the key constraints, which calls for more increased effectiveness and coordination, including the fact that of the sort of very tight fiscal space, also the need to focus on some of the root causes of food insecurity and malnutrition, including climate, conflict, and violence, which have all increased and are reasons for some of what we are seeing in terms of food insecurity. Then just very quickly, what is WFP doing to support more food systems that respond and recover from the COVID-19? Just a couple of points. The real transformation here must occur in regions and in countries and in communities through policies, investments, and also actions. And thanks to our extensive work in buying, storing, distributing food in more than 80 countries, we are active in supporting food systems even at the local level, working with all the stakeholders across the food system. First, in the Sahel, for example, WFP, we are supporting restoring to productive potential degraded lands that have not been used for 30, 40 years, okay, and creating a more sustainable community-based management of these resources. And in fact, we have, since just the end of 2018, we have supported communities to rehabilitate and bring back to productive use something like 70,000 hectares of degraded land. We try to use our procurement as a catalyst to support small producers, support small, medium enterprises to strengthen their capacities. And in this regard, in fact, just to give an example, in 2020, we purchased locally and in the region something like $133 million worth of food in 2020 alone. And we are also using our cash transfers to support the demand side, the cash that we transfer to vulnerable households to support the demand side and to create, make more access, create access to nutritious foods, especially. And we are, of course, also working with institutions such as the IFIs. The colleague from the African Development Bank just spoke, for how we integrate, food systems approach into the overall agricultural food policy planning processes and their implementation. We want to align our investments very much along the policies of the regional bodies and governments and to complement and increase efficiency of public spending in two main areas. And these are evidence generation and then also creating the environment for shock preparedness and also climate mitigation actions. Those are just the comments I wanted to make. And again, just to commend IFPRI for a well-written and quite thoughtful and very timely report. Thank you. Back to you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Chris, also for telling us what the World Food Program is doing in West Africa to address this difficult situation. We're now entering the Q&A session of this event. And again, you're invited to submit questions in the chat box. And I think we should kick off with a question about vaccines. John, you mentioned the fact that we are certainly not finished with this pandemic, that it may in fact be a long pandemic that we're looking at. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of how you see the vaccination playing out in different parts of the world. And then maybe after that, we can ask Sam to drill down a little bit further in Africa. We know that the health impacts to date were relatively less in Africa than in other regions. And how do you see the future, in particular, depending on the rate of, if the rate of vaccination can pick up or not in Africa? So let me first turn to you, John, for maybe a bit of a global picture on vaccination.
Yeah, so I think the concern globally is that if there's a slow rollout globally, that because of the breadth, the number of people involved, that variants become more and more important. And that's something that we don't often see. For example, in the big Ebola epidemic in West Africa 4 or 5 years ago, you know, it was wide, but it's nothing like the billions of people and every part of the globe that's involved in this. So the variants are much more important now than they usually are in an epidemic. And so the slow rollout means that there's going to be changes. I mean, it's not like the virus is smart or whatever. It's just responding and moving in whatever way it can. And so that's why the variants become important. If it's limited in time and space, the pandemic, then that's less of a problem. So that's the kind of global issue and why it's important to get vaccine distributed globally. So that's that, and then I'll hand over to Sam to talk more specifically about Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte and John. So this actually was one of the key things that was discussed over the weekend. We've just seen that Africa is way behind the curve there, and as John is saying, because of these new variants, what the implications also are that with the current vaccines, even as Africa gets vaccinated with those ones, they may not be as effective against some of the new variants. And so one of the most important things that was discussed is continuing through what we know that works, right? What we know that works. And it means really analyzing those risk factors across the continent and across different countries, which I already talked about, and I showed some of the statistics in terms of population density, cooler temperatures, connectivity with the rest of the world. So what it means is that the way we saw the recommendations in terms of masking, social distancing, avoiding large crowds, those are still very important. Masking, hand washing, those are still the most effective tools that we know are in place would work. So while we're waiting for specific vaccines and some of the things that I mentioned, what it means is that the various regions and various countries have to use the science on these, how the incidence of the virus is happening, to continue with their restrictions in place. Of course, we know we also learned that a lot of the initial restrictions did not work, and there were huge protests. For example, restrictions in rural areas where there's a lot of space may not be as important as in urban cities. So what we know is that it's in the cities, the cities that are most dense, where the age populations are. So as we're still waiting for vaccines, we shouldn't abandon the tools that we know that work. And Egypt, our gentleman, the minister from Egypt, already talked about some of the digitalization. There's a lot of tools that is being used at the continent-wide level in terms of tracking, surveillance, and especially on sequencing of these new variants in there. So all of these should help with that. Thank you.
Charlotte, just quickly, I mean, what we've got here is an investment problem, though, in production, distribution, and delivery. We don't have a science problem. These are unbelievable vaccines in the short time, and they can be tweaked for variants. So let's not be we should be very optimistic at the science tools we have, but we have to invest to move on this.
Thank you, John, for emphasizing that, and thank you also, Sam. Let me turn to Yo Swinen with a broad question. You've highlighted the importance of resilience in your presentation, Yo. And yet, considering all of the needs that many African countries are facing, where do they prioritize when it comes to really bolstering resilience for this ongoing shock, but also for future shocks? Keeping in mind, of course, that there are country-specific issues, but at a general level, how would you advise policymakers to look at strengthening resilience?
Thanks, Charlotte, for this question. It's, you can, I mean, there is no single instrument which will create resilience, right? So as we have emphasized very strongly in the report, it's really, you have to look at it from a systemic perspective. And so one of the ways to look at it is basically you can look at what is needed at a consumption side. We know that foods, the safety nets are really important, the social protection we talked about today, what is needed at the production side, and what is needed through the value chain. Of course, then the systems, a part of the systems around it, like how to deal with better nutrition and with the environmental effects, okay? Now, I think what is important is that there is a very strong interaction right now between resilience and inclusion, okay? And so we have seen, I mean, one thing I was part of the launch of the global report on food crisis last week, and almost everybody was emphasizing there that, what we see with COVID now, it's reinforcing the problems of inequality and of poverty. And so if you want to deal with resilience in the future, you have to structurally address poverty as well. And so that means that a number of the measures that we have laid out in the report, for example, the food safety, the social security systems, the social safety nets are a good example, okay? Because by doing that, you address at the same time the resilience on the consumption side and the poverty issues, the inequality issues. There are other things also along the value. Think about access to digital technologies, access to finance. I mean, these are really important on the production side. Basically, liquidity, financial liquidity is crucial. The new technologies will allow a whole bunch of things that we can do both in anticipation of the shocks, in responding to them, etc. And I think there it's crucial, okay, that when we introduce these resilience measures, that you make sure that you're not creating more inequality. Make sure that the smallholders are involved in access to digital services. As we've heard some really interesting stories, for example, here, I think in the presentations as well. And make sure that the weakest, okay, also the women and children are involved in some of these resilience measures, and that basically the resilience measures are conducive or consistent or coherent with your inequality measure. I think these are important priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Yo. We have a question which I think we should direct to Martin from the African Development Bank. And the question is, massive investments are needed to transform food systems. Can national budgets fund these within a reasonable time frame? And maybe we can add to that. If not, what are some of the other ways in order to be able to finance some of these investments? Martin, maybe this is something that you've addressed in your recent meetings, I imagine.
Yes, Charlotte, thank you very much. In fact, at the recent meeting, it was demonstrated that we require something in the neighborhood of $30 to $40 billion every year to transform food systems in Africa. Of this, national governments are only going to provide like 19 billion, give or take a few more billions, and the development banks and the private sector have to come up with the rest. One clear thing that has been shown is first and foremost is that the policy environment to attract private sector investments, the regulatory environment to create a level playing field, particularly in the input sector, laws that protect the sale of quality seeds and quality inputs, and punishes the sale of substandard inputs are required. Another very clear thing is the cross-border trade. That's where the African continental free trade region comes in very important. The tariffs and the difficulties of crossing borders with other inputs of food is often sometimes so high that it discourages businesses from cross-border trade. So we need to attract private sector investments through policy and policy reforms, and also and regulatory and also cross-border trade, reforms on one side, but on the other side, the development, banks and the development partners have to better coordinate their efforts with with government. I know very well that some countries where have shown some really good success, like Ethiopia, Senegal, countries like Kenya, Zambia, you have shown real progress, in respect to the indices of food and nutrition security, like production, access, affordability of nutritious foods. You can see very clearly that governments have a structured, well-designed program that everybody fits into, development partners and MDBs, everybody fits into it. So, we need better coordination because it's a lot of money, even though, for the developed world, maybe that's not so much money, but for Africa, $30 to $40 billion, is a lot of money. But I think it can be done if we just make the required, reforms and also have a clear structured program that people can buy into, and not something that is so that is always changing, with different governments. Thank you. Back to you, Charlotte. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin. Hopefully, between the COVID and the upcoming summit, some of this agenda can be implemented, and there are, of course, important investment needs. And I think the point you make about the private sector is crucial here. How do we best attract the private sector funding? Chris, we have a question about the activities of the World Food Program in Africa. Can you tell us in particular how WFP is supporting smallholder farmers to be more resilient to the climate crisis?
All right, sorry, I was on mute there. Thank you very much for the question. And I'd like to relate this to actually one of the important goals that has come out of your report, the IFPRI report. I mean, you call it inclusiveness. And it's important that as we discuss going forward, an important community, especially in Africa, who are really the ones who are responsible for most of the food that we consume, that is smallholder farmers, are not forgotten. Okay. And a couple of things, I think Joe Sweeney mentioned it, but if you look at the food system from maybe a production, aggregation, processing, distribution, and consumption sort of wheel, okay? In every one of these 5 that I mentioned, there are a number of challenges, and I could sort of list a couple of them in each of these areas. And what we are trying to do is to try to, as part of an efficient and improved food system, is to focus on some of those constraints and challenges, especially to smallholder farmers. So on the production side, of course, climate is one of the challenges. And here, mitigating through water, better management of water harvesting schemes, etc., barrages, dams, and basically improved means of managing water. I read in an African Development Bank report a few years ago, which stuck with me, that if you look at the amount of time women are working in Africa just to go and fetch water, it is equivalent to the total amount of working hour, time people spend working in France. And now, anything that reduces this, if you cut this down to a third or less, that is releasing potential capacity for women who are involved in these chores to use for other things. So improving that is one of them. Now, if you take a smallholder living in that sort of context with climate, what are the issues? Another one is drought-resistant seed types. Promoting the use of local cereals more than some of the ones that have long supply chains. And we have good examples, for example, in West Africa, Fonio and others that need to be promoted. Another thing is the whole issue of risk management, weather insurance, yield insurance, making these things available to the smallholder farmers. In West Africa, for example, we've been running a program that today we have some like 12,000 smallholder farmers in Senegal who are on weather-based insurance. But in fact, it is not meant to solve that problem, but meant to be a laboratory, which if you model something and if it works, you take to government. And for example, in Zambia, to pick another part of Africa, where through modeling weather risk insurance, the World Food Program was able to then engage the government of Zambia, okay? And now the government of Zambia, by learning from that experience we had for about 7,000 farmers, have now been able to design a weather insurance scheme that 1 million farmers in Zambia are benefiting from as part of the input subsidy program for Zambia. So these are the sorts of things that need to be done. Okay, insurance, also warehouse receipt systems, trying to make sure that these smallholder farmers are linked first to micro aggregators. What are the challenges for micro aggregators? Trying to help solve the problems of these micro aggregators, and then that link then to the larger aggregators. What are the problems for processors? Is it sustained supply chains, quality products, whatever, and trying to address them. So the point I'm trying to make is that we are trying to work across this, what I'll call a wheel of production, aggregation, processing, distribution, and consumption, and identifying the specific challenges that afflict in particular the most vulnerable in our communities and smallholder farmers, and identifying those problems and working not necessarily the World Food Program alone, but with partners and also bringing those sort of issues to the other entities who are even more competent to address it, so that we then gradually create an ecosystem of that inclusiveness, which is one that I really liked in your report, or the principles of a good food system. Maybe I'll stop there in the interest of time, but just to give a few examples.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And what a great demonstration of how much more WFP is doing than just providing food aid, right? You're really looking at the structural issues in the agricultural sectors and the countries you're serving. So that's great. We're almost out of time. So it's been a great discussion. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jemima, who is going to try to summarize and give us her final thoughts on the way forward, perhaps. Over to you, Jemima.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I guess this is one of those conversations you don't want to end just by some of the contributions that are coming in. But I really would like to thank all our speakers, Martin from IFDB, Yunusa Mbalo, Chris, Mohammed, for being with us this afternoon, and to the IFPRI speakers as well, who did such a fantastic job of summarizing what is an extremely rich report. One of the things that you said that really stuck with me is that this is a transformative moment in history for food systems. We are seeing innovations accelerate at a much higher rate than we've ever seen before in response to the pandemic. And I think it's such a huge opportunity for us to accelerate and to scale some of these innovations, and to do them in the way that Chris describes, that we're looking at the whole food system and unlocking some of those bottlenecks that exist in the system, especially for the most vulnerable, for women, for children, and for smallholder farmers. I think what's also been great to see is the regional organizations, including the Africa Union and the AFDB, really step up to the challenge of supporting countries and supporting those that depend on food systems. But from what I'm hearing, I think there's a couple of things that we need to be sure that we are putting together. One is putting investments in the right place. I know Martin has given some numbers, but I think those numbers won't mean anything if we don't make sure that they're going into the right kinds of investments that have the biggest impact on food systems. So how can we make better prioritization of innovations, whether these innovations are institutional, whether they are social, whether they are technological, and deliver them in ways that are efficient, in ways that are inclusive. I think the second thing I hear is partnerships, and I am so glad that some of the partners that IFPRI are working with in the region are here. We have a great partnership with WFP in West Africa around the resilience work, but also in terms of addressing and prioritizing innovations for reducing vulnerability. So I think this is something that we will have to accelerate more and to be much more strategic in terms of how we coordinate our support to governments if we are really going to build back better. So this financing facility, I think, is such a great innovation that when it's backed up with the right partnerships, that's backed up with the right tools, data, and evidence to support governments to prioritize, is going to be very, very impactful. In the interest of time, Charlotte, I think I'll end it there. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward. I think this report is just the first step in terms of using the evidence that's contained in there to actually support governments, to support stakeholders, to support smallholder farmers and others to build back better after the pandemic. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you, Jemima. Thanks also from me to everybody for tuning in today, and a big thanks also to IFPRI's event management team, and a great thank you to all of our speakers. Have a great rest of your day or evening.